Only 3 weeks ago on this show, although it feels like 3 months, I urged the Morrison government to stop faffing around and start taking coronavirus seriously. I quoted the Italian writer Thomas Pueo, who said that we only had a matter of days to act, but that countries that act fast reduce the deaths by a factor of 10, and that acting fast drastically reduces the number of people who get the disease. 3 weeks ago, while the PM was still planning to attend a footy match, I urged the government to act swiftly and decisively to close our borders, enforce social distancing and stop crowds from gathering. Some of my colleagues here at Sky were horrified by the idea, but as I said then, this is a numbers and contact game, pure and simple. I also added, by the way, that what we didn't need was massive government economic packages. Well, an awful lot has happened in those 3 weeks, and although it's early days, it appears that by acting swiftly, Australia may just actually have pulled it off. According to the Australian newspaper, the federal government is increasingly confident it has broken the back of Australia's COVID-19 pandemic, with new data showing tough border controls and social distancing measures have nearly halved the growth rate of new infections. Scott Morrison has said that had the virus kept growing at the same rate it was 12 days ago, we would now have more than 10,500 cases. It's around 5,500. And Greg Hunt has confirmed the rate of growth has dropped far further and far quicker than they expected. Excellent. Now, I say excellent with one massive qualification. There is a terrifying chance that over the next few weeks we see a second wave of contagion coming through and the numbers of infections and fatalities dramatically rise. There is a very real possibility that that could happen. But there is also a very real possibility that by going in hard and fast, as we urged, Australia may have prevented the exponential spread of the virus that has been seen in so many other countries. I don't want to count our live Wuhan bats before they have hatched, but fingers crossed, touch wood, and all of that, we may have stopped the exponential spread. Remember, we won't defeat the virus for years, possibly ever. We just have to flatten that curve so we remain on top of it. That is what victory looks like. But a second deadly danger also lurks, and that is that we win the battle, but we lose the war. That in preventing the spread of the virus, we destroy the very fabric of our nation, our economy, our freedoms, our prosperity. That's too high a price to pay. Again, it's a big if, but if we do not see a second exponential wave of contagion in the next 3 weeks, we must start preparing to preserve and revitalise our economic prosperity and freedom-loving way of life urgently. We've been lucky. Let's now be clever. Talk of a 6-month recession and millions unemployed and relying on handouts is unacceptable. Police rushing around arresting Mrs. Kafoops on her park bench is unacceptable. Entire towns going bankrupt in rural and regional areas far removed from the contagion hotspots of the big cities is unacceptable. Resigning ourselves to a fate of quasi-socialism, impoverishment, and our kids being crippled by decades of exponential debt is not acceptable. I give 10 out of 10 to the Morrison government for the swift handling of the health crisis to date, and the public have by and large been exemplary. But now the really tough work begins. We must fight just as hard, in fact harder, for every single Australian small business person and every single Australian job starting now. Because these jobs, those jobs, and the dignity of those jobs are at the very heart of the future of the great Australian family. Unemployment is also a deadly virus all of its own. Unemployment breeds despair, misery, violence, self-loathing, and inevitably it also leads to people dying tragically who shouldn't. As Katie Hopkins referred to earlier, the UK Daily Telegraph reports that the Professor of Risk Management at Bristol University has calculated that if a lockdown causes the economy to shrink by more than 6.4%, then the recession will cost more lives than the coronavirus itself. Now, these are numbers, but the point he makes is clear. Just as time was of the essence 3 weeks ago, so it is now. Josh Frydenberg's JobKeeper safety net package has some worthwhile components, but there is no escaping the fact that it is a hell of a lot of money that our kids will be repaying for the rest of their lives. As every trapeze artist knows, the best safety net is the one you never use. The government must find a way to maintain the fight against the virus, but give us a clear timetable for urgently reopening businesses, whether in specific parts of the economy or in specific parts of the country. Clearly, testing of large parts of the community is critical to determine where the disease is and, more importantly, where it isn't. Isolating those most vulnerable is imperative. But like the virus, the economy is also a numbers and contact game. Businesses must have customers to survive. Businesses must have turnover to survive. The concept of hibernating the economy is socialist claptrap. Waiting months to begin the recovery and leaving a massive bill to future generations is madness. Italy is planning to reopen during May. Parts of America will likely do so too. Our danger period for a re-emergence of the exponential spread of the virus is around Anzac Day. Coincidentally, in the next 3 weeks, we should be getting finally proper useful data from the US about just how common the coronavirus is in the population at large. At the moment, we have no idea. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is a US public health specialist. Here he is speaking this week to the Hoover Institute.
Nobody knows the number. The numbers we've seen are consistent with a very, very wide range. From an epidemic that will kill 2 to 4 million people on one end, and an epidemic that will kill 50,000 to 100,000 people on the other. That's an incredibly broad range, and the policies you do to avoid 2 to 4 million deaths are very, very different than the policies you do to avoid, 50,000 to 100,000 deaths.
The results of the US test will be known later this month and will give us a huge amount of information, finally, about the most effective policies to pursue. But assuming the virus remains at acceptable non-exponential levels over the next fortnight, the government must begin opening businesses across Australia and spell out a clear timetable and a clear set of metrics to rapidly return the entire economy back to normal. Within weeks, not months. We acted swiftly and decisively against the virus to save lives. Now we must act swiftly, just as swiftly and just as decisively to save our economy. We owe it to our kids.